In a post-apocalyptic future, Mallory hears a message over the radio about a safe haven where everyone is welcome. She gathers her two young, unnamed children and, with a serious tone, announces that they will row downstream. It is extremely important that the children do not remove their eye patches, otherwise they will die. She then takes a box containing her pet birds, and the group leaves the house, using a rope to mark their path to the boat without being able to see anything. It all started 5 years ago. Mallory, a pregnant artist, was visited by her sister, Jessica. During their conversation, the two didn't pay much attention to the news report about mysterious mass suicides starting in Siberia and spreading across Europe. Later, the sisters went to the hospital for Mallory's pregnancy checkup. The checkup went smoothly, but on the way back, Mallory and Jessica noticed a woman acting strangely, banging her head against a glass door. When they stepped outside, the situation worsened. The streets were in chaos, people were frantically fleeing, crashing cars, and doing anything to kill themselves. It seemed that the strange phenomenon spreading across Europe had reached America. In a panic, the two sisters quickly got into the car and tried to drive away. But suddenly, Jessica's eyes turned a strange color, and she began driving wildly, ignoring Mallory's pleas. The car sped dangerously, resulting in a rollover crash. Fortunately, both survived. Mallory carefully crawled out of the car, but was horrified to witness Jessica step into the middle of the road, only to be struck and killed by an oncoming truck. Devastated and panicked, Mallory ran with the crowd, where the chaos grew worse. Cars began exploding around her. When Mallory was knocked down by the crowd, a woman ran out of a house to help her, ignoring her husband Douglas's protests. However, before she could reach Mallory, the woman suddenly went into a trance, as if speaking to an invisible person. She then stepped into a burning car, which exploded shortly after. Soon after, a man named Tom came to help Mallory to her feet and brought her into the house. Although Douglas strongly opposed and didn't want to open the door, the homeowner Greg decided to intervene and let them in. Inside, a group of other survivors had also gathered. The group began sharing their theories about what was happening, such as demons or the apocalypse. However, no one had a clear explanation or could prove anything. The only thing they all agreed on was this: simply looking at the strange entities outside would drive people to commit suicide. A couple in the group received a call from their son, who was in danger. Despite the warning, they decided to leave the house to find their child. Meanwhile, the news report continued to cover the phenomenon spreading across the world, but soon the signal was cut off, and there were no more broadcasts or calls. Recognizing the threat, the remaining members of the group decided to cover all the windows to prevent anyone from seeing outside. Back to the present, Mallory and the two children had been on the river for 6 hours. She continued to try to contact others via the radio, while keeping all three of them covered under a blanket. Mallory also frequently checked the birds in the box. When they started becoming restless, Mallory began hearing entities whispering her name. Despite this, she tried to ignore it and continued the journey. Back in the past, the group of survivors in the house suddenly heard a knock at the door. It was Olympia, a pregnant woman begging for help. Douglas strongly opposed letting anyone else into the house, arguing that it would increase the risk of danger. However, Mallory called him heartless, and the group decided to let Olympia in. Mallory held a rifle just in case, and everyone closed their eyes until they were sure Olympia was harmless. Then, Greg volunteered to check the situation outside using the security cameras. The others tied Greg to a chair in front of the screen and left him alone there. Greg tried to concentrate, keeping his eyes fixed on the screen. At first, everything seemed normal, but after a few minutes, his expression changed. The group heard a strange noise from the room and rushed in. They found Greg had fallen from the chair, his head hitting the floor hard, and he died instantly. Immediately, the group destroyed the screen to prevent anyone else from being in danger. That night, Mallory couldn't sleep and walked around the house. She heard a strange sound, but it turned out to be Lucy and Felix sneaking around with each other. Back to the present, Mallory and the two children had been on the river for 14 hours. Suddenly, she heard a man's voice advising her to take off the blindfold, assuring her that everything was safe and even promising food. However, Mallory told the children to absolutely not follow the advice and pulled out her gun, firing randomly into the unknown. All her shots missed, and the man jumped onto the boat to attack them. At that moment, the birds in the box began to cry out loudly. The man tried to remove Mallory's blindfold, insisting that the entities outside were beautiful. Mallory fought fiercely, and after a tense struggle, she finally killed him with a machete. Back in the past, the group in the house started running out of food and realized that help from the outside wouldn't come. Mallory, Tom, Douglas, Lucy and Charlie volunteered to go to the supermarket to search for food, hoping that being in a larger group would keep them safer. They painted and covered the car windows so they couldn't see outside, then used the GPS to navigate through streets filled with abandoned cars and bodies. On the way, the GPS detected something surrounding the car. They could see the shadow of something shaking the car, accompanied by the sound of whistling wind. Panicked, the group started driving faster, but the sound and shaking grew more intense. Finally, the GPS announced that they had arrived at the supermarket. The group quickly ran into the supermarket and didn't remove their blindfolds until they had covered all the windows. Then, they split up to gather essential supplies, not just food but also baby items. Mallory found some birds and decided to take them with her. Douglas thought the group should stay there, but Mallory scolded him, emphasizing that leaving the people back at the house would be cruel. Suddenly, they heard a knock on the door, and Charlie recognized the familiar voice. It was his colleague, who had accidentally gotten trapped in a freezer and was begging to be let out. The group wasn't sure whether to trust him, so they only cracked the door open to check. At that moment, the birds in the box began to screech wildly, confirming that the man was actually an entity trying to deceive them. The man started shouting, insisting that everyone should look at the entity and push the door harder. Charlie rushed forward, pushing him back into the freezer, giving the others a chance to lock the door. However, blood began to seep through the crack at the bottom of the door, confirming that Charlie had sacrificed himself. The group left, still hearing the man's voice begging to be let out. That night at the house, the group heard a sound like a car being driven away. They rushed to the garage and discovered that Lucy and Felix had stolen their only vehicle to escape. Back in the present, Mallory finally stopped after 24 hours of non-stop rowing. However, she was too worried about the children and quickly resumed the journey. While rowing, the boat collided with a truck submerged in the water, causing the boy to fall into the river. Mallory immediately rushed over, grabbing the boy just before he sank. But in the process, they dropped the blanket and all the food they had brought into the water. Mallory did her best to warm the boy with a jacket and decided to stop the boat at a riverbank. She told the children not to leave the boat while she went to search for supplies. Mallory tied a rope to the boat and began exploring the forest. After a while, she found a building, where she gathered food and a new blanket. The rope wasn't long enough to take her farther, so she tied it to some furniture inside the building and continued investigating. Suddenly, she heard a noise and saw the rope shaking, followed by the shadow of something moving outside. Panicking, Mallory immediately ran out of the building, crossing the forest as the entity began whispering her name. Mallory blindly fires in self-defense, but the gunshot sends the girl off the boat to find Mallory. Fortunately, Mallory quickly moved and reached the girl just in time before the entity could harm her. She pulled the girl back to the boat and scolded her for disobeying, reminding both children that if the situation became too dangerous, they must leave Mallory behind and save themselves. Back in the past, another survivor knocked on the door of the house. Olympia, without consulting the others, took it upon herself to let him in. The man's name was Gary, and after Tom checked to ensure Gary wasn't hiding anything dangerous, he shared his story. Gary explained that only those with mental issues could survive when facing the entities. He had escaped from a group of madmen, who had broken out of a psychiatric hospital and were forcing others to look at the entity, claiming it was beautiful. Douglas didn't trust Gary and tried to force him out of the house with a gun. But Cheryl knocked Douglas unconscious and locked him in the garage, allowing Gary to stay with them. Back in the present, Mallory and the two children had been on the river for 38 hours. She covered all three of them with a blanket, warning that they were approaching the waterfall, the most dangerous part of the journey. Someone would have to open their eyes to guide them, and both children volunteered. However, Mallory remembered the promise she made to Olympia that she would take care of Olympia's daughter if anything happened. She also couldn't bear the thought of harming her son, so in the end, Mallory decided to take the risk and pass through the waterfall without opening her eyes. Back in the past, both Mallory and Olympia began to go into labor at the same time. Tom and Cheryl helped them upstairs to assist. Meanwhile, Gary pulled out a series of drawings of terrifying creatures and began adding a new drawing. This revealed that Gary was actually one of the lunatics who had escaped from the psychiatric hospital. Afterwards, Gary took Mallory's birds and locked them in the refrigerator, then tore down all the papers covering the windows. Douglas saw this action from a distance. When Tom came downstairs and discovered Gary's drawings, he was attacked and knocked unconscious immediately by Gary. Gary opened the garage door, hoping Douglas would see the entity, but Douglas quickly covered his eyes. Upstairs, Olympia and Mallory both gave birth to healthy and beautiful babies. However, Gary suddenly entered the room and pulled the curtains in front of Olympia. She was immediately drawn to the entity. Mallory quickly took the baby from Olympia's hands before she ran to the window and committed suicide. Shortly after, Gary grabbed Cheryl and forced her to open her eyes to look outside, causing Cheryl to also commit suicide with scissors. As Mallory hid under the blanket with the two babies, Douglas appeared with a rifle and fired blindly, injuring Gary's arm. However, Gary quickly retaliated, jumping on Douglas, pushing him over the railing, and stabbing him with the scissors. The rifle fell to the floor, and Tom tried to pick it up at the same time as Gary, causing the weapon to fire. Mallory heard 2 gunshots before someone approached her. Fortunately, it was Tom, who had won the struggle. 5 years passed, and Mallory and Tom lived together, raising the 2 children as a family. They had set up a system to keep the house safe and used ropes whenever they needed to go outside to search for supplies. One afternoon, while Mallory was out gathering food, she heard the sound of a car nearby. She waited until it left, then quickly returned home to tell Tom. The two agreed that they would no longer go outside alone. That evening, they received a radio signal announcing a safe camp with plenty of food and supplies downstream. The voice on the radio provided detailed instructions, and Tom marked it on the map. To pass the waterfall, opening their eyes was essential, and the voice advised following the forest birds, as they could signal when the entity was near. Tom wanted to go to the safe camp, but Mallory refused because she thought it was a trap. A while later, when the family was out searching for supplies, they heard the sound of cars again. Tom decided to go out as a decoy to distract them, while Mallory and the children withdrew safely. The drivers were a group of crazies, and they demanded Tom look at the entity. When they discovered Mallory and the two children, Tom opened fire on them. He managed to take down several of them, but they also returned fire. To protect his family, Tom had to remove his blindfold to aim more accurately. In a few seconds, he wiped out the crazy group, but then he saw the entity and immediately committed suicide. Mallory collapsed from the loss of Tom and decided it was time to leave for the safe shelter. At this point, they had been drifting on the river for 42 hours and were nearing the treacherous waterfall. As they reached the rough waters, Mallory did her best to navigate, but the boat capsized, and all three of them fell into the water. Mallory screamed for the children and found the boy in the water, but the girl had managed to swim to shore. Fortunately, Mallory quickly located the girl as she was carrying a bell and kept shaking it so Mallory could hear it. The three of them then walked through the forest, where they heard the whispering of the entity, this time using Tom's voice to call them. Mallory tried to run, but she slipped down a small hill. The whispers targeted the children, nearly causing the boy to remove his blindfold. But Mallory was just in time to find him and stop him. However, she couldn't find the girl and began to panic. Mallory apologized for yelling at her earlier, and it was her voice that led the girl to return to her. Finally, the three of them followed the sounds of the birds but had to run when the entity suddenly surrounded them. They stumbled a few times while running but eventually reached the shelter. The door opened just in time, before the entity could reach them. Inside the shelter, Mallory's eyes were checked, and everything was confirmed safe for them to stay. They met the person who had been speaking on the radio and Mallory discovered that the shelter was a school for the blind, where many survivors were living. The school also kept birds as a warning system when the entity appeared. Now Mallory's family could start a real life. Mallory decided to name the children. The girl was called Olympia, after her mother, and the boy was named after Tom. Then, Mallory opened the box and released her birds, allowing them to join the others in the safety of the shelter. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss more interesting videos like this one. You can search for the movie Bird Box to watch the full episode. Thank you for watching.